Clara Thorne stood at the edge of the grand foyer of the Oakhaven Opera House. Feeling like a speck of dust on a silk tablecloth, the air inside was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and French perfume. A cloying mist that made it hard to draw a clean breath. Above her, the massive chandeliers flickered with 1,000 candles, casting a golden glow over men in stiff suits and women draped in satin. But the light didn't feel warm. To Clara, it felt like a spotlight, exposing every fray in the woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the only thing she had left of her mother. "Careful, Clara," a voice hissed, sharp and cold as a winter frost. "If you lean against the wallpaper, you might leave a grease stain." Beatrice Thorne glided into view, her silk gown the color of a bruised plum, shimmering with a vanity that cost more than most men in this town earned in a year. She looked at Clara with a smile that never reached her eyes, a smile sharpened for the kill. "I told father you should have stayed in the attic," Beatrice continued, her voice a low, intimate murmur designed to sting. "At least there, the shadows are kind to your sort. Out here, in the light, you're just a reminder of what happens when good blood is thinned by nomad trash." Clara kept her spine straight, her hands hidden beneath the folds of her shawl. She had learned long ago that flinching was an invitation for more pain. "I am here because father requested it." "Beatrice, nothing more." "Requested it?" Beatrice laughed, a brittle, metallic sound that cut through the music of the banjo player nearby. "Oh, Clara, you still think you're a guest. You think you're a daughter." Beatrice stepped closer, the smell of her heavy lavender water suffocating. She reached out, running a gloved finger along the tattered edge of Clara's shawl. "In the world of the frontier, everything has a price. Those who can't provide a legacy must provide a profit. Do you know why the mayor finally allowed you out of the shadows tonight? It wasn't for the music. It was for the auction." Clara's heart stumbled. "The auction? Mr. Sterling from the silver mine is looking for a domestic arrangement." Beatrice whispered, her eyes dancing with a cruel light. "Father's debts don't pay themselves. Tonight, you aren't a thorn, you're a down payment." Before Clara could find her voice, a heavy hand landed on her shoulder. It was Mayor Thorne. He looked everywhere but at his daughter's face, his eyes shifting nervously toward the wealthy men gathered by the bar. His collar seemed too tight, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and desperation. "Clara," he muttered, his voice weak, a hollow shell of authority. "Beatrice is just, she's helping you understand. Times are hard, we all have to make sacrifices for the family name." "Sacrifices?" Clara's voice was a whisper, raw and trembling. "You're selling me to a man who treats his workers like cattle." "Watch your tone," the mayor snapped, though he still wouldn't meet her gaze. "You've lived on my charity for 20 years. It's time you earned your keep." He turned away, his cowardice a physical weight in the room, leaving Clara trapped between her sister's malice and her father's betrayal. Beatrice leaned in one last time, her lips brushing Clara's ear. "Don't bother crying. In Oakhaven, even the tears are made of lead." Clara watched them walk away, her fingers gripping the bot-bam, the star-shaped birthmark on her wrist, beneath her shawl. She felt like a ghost, a hollow thing drifting through a celebration of her own demise. In the high society of the frontier, there is a cruel paradox regarding the things we carry. We are told that a name is a shield, that a family is a fortress. But for those like Clara, the family name was the cage, and the mother's shawl she wore was the only thing that actually belonged to her. There is a deep, bitter truth in the way we treat those who don't fit. In this gilded house, Beatrice wore her diamonds like armor, believing that her status made her untouchable. But the paradox of the mark is this: those who scream the loudest about their own worth are often the ones most terrified of being unremarkable. Beatrice mocked Clara for being unmarked by wealth, for being nothing. Because if Clara was something, if Clara had value without the silks and the titles, then Beatrice's entire world was a lie. The elite of Oakhaven believed that destiny only visited those with silver in their pockets. They looked at a girl in a tattered shawl and saw a failure of fate. They didn't realize that sometimes, the most powerful threads of destiny aren't woven in silk. They are forged in the dust. In the quiet spaces where a soul learns to survive without ever losing its light. Clara Thorne was invisible to the town. But she was standing in the center of a storm she didn't yet know was coming to save her. The banjo music didn't stop. But it seemed to lose its breath. The heavy oak doors of the opera house swung open. Not with a bang, but with a deliberate, heavy thud that rattled the crystal glasses on the silver trays. A cold draft swept in from the Sierra night, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and parched earth, cutting through the thick, cloying layers of expensive lavender and stale tobacco. The chatter died in waves. Jewels stopped sparkling as ladies froze. And the town's elite found themselves holding their breath. Silas, Silver Eye, Vane didn't walk into a room, he claimed it. He stood in the arched doorway, a silhouette of rugged leather and iron against the moonlit dust of Oakhaven. He was an outlaw, a ghost of the high plains, a man whose name was whispered in fear by sheriffs and in awe by the broken. His presence felt like a physical weight, a pressure that slowed the very heartbeat of the room. He was dressed in charcoal black duster coat, worn and stained by the road, but it hung on his broad shoulders with a terrifying elegance. His namesake eye, a piercing, metallic silver, scanned the crowd with the predatory stillness of a hawk. Clara felt the air turn to static. The star-shaped birthmark on her wrist began to thrum, a dull, rhythmic heat that matched the distant, lonely whistle of a locomotive rolling through the valley. It was a frequency only she could hear, a tugging at the very center of her chest that made her lungs feel tight and her skin prickle. Beatrice smoothed her plum-colored silk, her eyes widening with a predatory hunger of her own. She stepped forward, flashing a practiced, diamond-bright smile, ready to charm the most dangerous man in the territory. But Silas didn't even blink in her direction. His gaze moved past the mayor's desperate grin, past the shimmer of gold lace and the stench of entitlement. He found her. Clara, tucked away by the shadows of a velvet curtain, felt his eyes lock onto hers like a physical blow. It was the first time in 20 years she felt truly seen, not as a ghost, not as a debt to be paid, but as a living, breathing soul. In that moment, the grand hall of the opera house felt like an elaborate stage play where the actors had forgotten their lines. The elite of Oakhaven lived in a world of social invisibility. They had spent years perfecting the art of looking through people like Clara, treating her as a fixture of the architecture rather than a human being. This is the cruelty of the price of belonging, the unspoken rule that you only exist if you possess the right name or the right silver. When a society decides you are invisible, they aren't just ignoring you, they are attempting to erase your very humanity. They want you to believe that without their approval, you are a shadow without a body. Clara had spent a lifetime trying to shrink herself to fit into the cracks they left behind, believing that her mother's tattered shawl was a cloak of shame rather than a banner of survival. But Silas Vane didn't care about the rules of belonging. He was a man who lived in the spaces between the lines. And to him, the invisible was the only thing worth looking at. He began to move. The crowd parted like water before a prow. No one jostled him. No one dared to block his path. The rhythmic click of his spurs against the polished floor sounded like a countdown. 5 feet. 3. Clara's back pressed against the cold stone pillar. She was trapped between the crushing weight of her family's expectations and the sudden, terrifying heat of this man's attention. Silas stopped close enough for her to smell the leather and the faint, wild scent of sagebrush clinging to his coat. His silver eye burned through the dim light, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck, and finally resting on the hand she had tucked nervously into the folds of her shawl. He didn't look at the mayor. He didn't look at the mine owners. He looked at the girl the world had tried to forget. "I've been listening for that whistle for a long time," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, like a shovel turning over dry earth. It sent a shiver down Clara's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The tension in the room was so thick it was suffocating. Beatrice's face was a mask of disbelief, her painted lips curling into something ugly. But Silas didn't turn. He reached out a hand, calloused, scarred, and steady, and held it palm up in the space between them. "Clara Thorne," he murmured, his voice pitched only for her. Yet it seemed to echo louder than any shout. "They think you're a ghost. But I see the star." In that moment, the price of belonging was shattered. Silas wasn't offering her a place in Oakhaven's society. He was offering her the terrifying freedom of the frontier. He was looking for the truth in her eyes, not the silver in her name. And for the first time in her life, Clara realized that being invisible to the world was exactly what had kept her soul intact for a man who knew how to hunt for treasures in the dark. The banjo player hesitated, the strings vibrating with a dying tension as Silas Vane stepped deeper into the golden light of the opera house. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was a physical barrier, thick with the scent of unwashed desert wind and the terror of the elite. Silas didn't look at the mayor. He didn't look at the men reaching for holsters they weren't brave enough to use. He walked straight toward the shadows, straight toward the girl in the tattered wool shawl. He stopped 2 paces from Clara. The silver in his eye seemed to catch every candle flame in the room, burning with an intensity that made her knees feel like water. Slowly, with a grace that belonged to a king rather than a killer, he extended his hand. "The next dance," he said. "It wasn't a request. It was a command to the universe. It belongs to me." Clara stared at his palm. It was wide, calloused by the reins of 1,000 horses and the cold steel of a Winchester. It was a hand that knew how to take what it wanted. Yet it trembled, just a fraction, as he waited for her. "You can't be serious." Beatrice's voice sliced through the silence. Brittle and high-pitched, she stepped forward, her purple silk rustling like the warning of a rattlesnake. She laughed, a sound so hollow it made the crystal chandeliers rattle. "Mr. Vane, surely a man of your reputation has better taste. You're asking a ghost to dance. You're asking a servant dressed in rags." Silas didn't turn his head. He didn't even acknowledge the air she breathed. His focus remained pinned on Clara, his silver gaze tracing the star-shaped mark on her wrist that was now glowing with a heat she could no longer ignore. "I am speaking to the only woman in this room who isn't wearing a mask," Silas murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Clara's chest. "She's a half-breed," Beatrice shrieked, the mask of society finally cracking to reveal the rot beneath. "Ask her about her mother. Silas, ask her about the nomad filth she came from. She's a ghost because she doesn't belong to Oakhaven, and she doesn't belong to the Thorne name. She's a nomad brat playing dress-up in a dead woman's shawl." The room gasped. The mayor stepped back, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. This was the secret they had buried in the dust for 20 years. The reason Clara was kept in the attic. The reason she was invisible. To Oakhaven, nomad blood was worse than a crime. It was a contagion. Clara felt the old shame rising like a tide. A cold, suffocating weight. She pulled her shawl tighter, ready to shrink back into the darkness where she had always lived. She was broken. She was a nomad. She was nothing. But Silas didn't flinch. He took the final step, closing the distance until the heat from his body washed over her. Smelling of sagebrush and rain, he reached out, not to pull her away, but to gently catch her chin, forcing her to look into that silver eye. "They call you a ghost because they're afraid of what you represent," Silas said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room like a tolling bell. "They think nomad blood is a weakness. They think being unmarked by their silver makes you worthless." He turned then, his gaze sweeping over the crowd like a scythe. The men winced. Beatrice stumbled back. "I've spent my life crossing the frontiers they're too cowardly to name." Silas growled. "I've seen cities built on lies and empires built on dust. And I've never seen anything as pathetic as a room full of sheep trying to look like wolves." He looked back at Clara, his expression softening into something so tender it hurt to watch. "Blood doesn't define a soul. Clara, the desert doesn't care about your father's name. And the wind doesn't ask for your pedigree. You think you're broken because you don't fit into their cage? In my world, broken just means you've been tested. It means you're the only thing here that's actually real." He didn't wait for her to answer. He took her hand, the one with the star, and pulled it toward his chest. Right over his heart, Clara felt the thrum of him. A steady, powerful rhythm that matched the whistle in the wind. "Let them watch," Silas whispered, Let them see what a queen looks like when she finally stops apologizing for existing." He signaled to the banjo player with a sharp nod. The music started again, but it was different now, faster, wilder, a frontier rhythm that didn't belong in a house of satin. Silas swept her into the center of the floor. Clara's shawl flared out like a gray wing, her simple boots clicking against the polished wood that was meant for velvet slippers. They danced on the edge of the abyss. Every pair of eyes in the room was a blade, every whisper a stone. But inside the circle of Silas's arms, the world of Oakhaven ceased to exist. Clara wasn't a thorn. She wasn't a nomad. She was a woman being claimed by the only man powerful enough to see her light. Beatrice stood on the sidelines. Her hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. She looked at Clara, the girl she had spent a lifetime erasing, and for the first time, she felt the cold shadow of her own insignificance. Clara was no longer invisible. She was the center of the universe, dancing with a man who would burn this whole town down just to keep her warm. The auction was over. The ghost had finally found her body. The music snapped like a dry twig under a boot. Silas Vane came to a halt in the center of the hall. His hand still locked with Clara's, his presence pulling the air right out of the room. Mayor Thorne stumbled forward, his face a ghostly pale, sweat beading on his upper lip as he tried to reclaim some shred of his crumbling authority. "Now see here, Vane," the mayor stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "This is a private event. Clara is my daughter, and she is engaged in a family matter." "A family matter?" Silas's laugh was a cold, jagged thing that rattled the crystal flutes on the tables. He stepped forward, drawing Clara with him, shielding her from the predatory stares of the town's elite. "Is that what you call a bill of sale? I've seen some low things in the frontier, Mayor, but selling your own blood to settle a gambling debt with a mine owner, that's a new kind of rot." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a secret being stripped bare in the midday sun. Clara felt her father shrink. Mayor Thorne stood there, his lips trembling, not with fear of Silas's silver eye, but because a truth he'd buried was finally screaming. As Silas's arm tightened around Clara's waist, the atmosphere in the hall turned to ice. The mayor looked into Clara's eyes that were a mirror of the woman he had once loved and then abandoned to memory, and he realized he had lost. He had told himself that ignoring her was for the good of the house, a way to appease his new, bitter life. But standing there, he saw his own soul for what it was, a hollow shell of a man who had sold his firstborn for a quiet life. Clara didn't need his protection anymore. She had the strength of the frontier at her back, and the mayor was left to live out his days in a house filled with the ghosts of his own cowardice. "Listen to me, all of you," Silas's voice boomed, cutting through the murmurs of the stunned crowd. "I didn't come to Oakhaven for your silver or your invitations. I came for what belongs to me. This woman is my star, my partner, and the only thorn worth the name. From this moment on, anyone who speaks a word against her answers to me. And I don't take kindly to people touching my things." The mayor sputtered. "You can't just, she's a thorn." "She's a survivor," Silas countered, his voice like iron. "And she's done with you." Clara looked at the man beside her, then back at the father who had kept her in the attic like a shameful secret. She felt the weight of the thorn name, a name that had felt like a lead shackle for 20 years, finally snap. She reached up and unpinned the silver family brooch from her shawl, letting it fall to the polished floor with a dull, insignificant clink. "I'm not a thorn," Clara said, her voice steady for the first time in her life. "I'm Clara, and I'm leaving." Silas didn't say a word. He simply turned, his spurs clicking a rhythmic anthem of defiance as he led her toward the heavy oak doors. Beatrice stood frozen, her plum silk gown looking garish and cheap in the face of such raw, unvarnished truth. The town's elite watched in a daze of disbelief as the ghost of Oakhaven walked out of her prison and into the moonlit dust. Outside, the air was sharp and sweet with the smell of freedom. Silas's black stallion stood waiting, snorting at the night air. He swung into the saddle with a fluid power and reached down for her. Clara took his hand, feeling the calloused strength, the honesty of a man who lived by his own laws. As she settled behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. She felt the distant whistle of the train again. But this time, it didn't sound lonely. It sounded like an invitation. She didn't look back at the lights of the opera house or the town that had tried to erase her. She buried her face against Silas's back, smelling the leather and the wild sage. And for the first time, she wasn't surviving. She was living. The dust of Oakhaven rose behind them, a veil closing on a past she no longer claimed. She had traded a gilded cage for the open trail, a hollow name for a solid heart. And as the stallion broke into a gallop toward the Sierra Peaks, Clara Thorne knew that the silence of the desert was better than any lie a town could tell. She was unmarked, she was a nomad, and she was finally home. If this story touched you, please take a second to like and subscribe. It helps me bring more journeys like Clara's to light. Where are you listening from tonight? Let's talk in the comments below. The desert at night was a different world. The suffocating perfume of the opera house had been replaced by the sharp, honest scent of sagebrush and cooling sand. Silas rode in silence for a long time, the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves against the dry earth acting as the only heartbeat in the vast, moonlit emptiness. Behind him, Clara held on tight, her face pressed against the rough leather of his coat. She felt the vibrations of the stallion's power. But more than that, she felt the terrifying weight of her own new freedom. Eventually, Silas pulled the reins near a cluster of ancient red rocks. He dismounted with fluid grace and reached up to help her down. His hands were steady, but as Clara's boots hit the dust, she felt a sudden, sharp chill. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the jagged realization of what she had done. She had walked away from everything she knew. "Why?" Clara whispered, her voice cracking in the stillness. "Why me, Silas? You could have had anyone in that room. Beatrice. She was what Oakhaven calls a prize. I'm just a ghost in a stolen shawl." Silas leaned against the warm stone of the canyon wall, the moonlight catching the silver in his eye. He didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of raw silver ore, turning it over in his calloused fingers. "You see this?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "The mines back there, they want the polished stuff, the smooth bars, they want everything to look the same, to be perfect, but they don't understand how silver is actually born." He stepped closer, the heat radiating from him cutting through the desert night. He took Clara's hand, the one with the star-shaped mark, and placed the rough ore in her palm. "People like the mayor and your sister. They spend their whole lives trying to hide their cracks. They coat themselves in silk and titles because they're terrified that if anyone saw the real them, they'd find nothing but dust. They hunt for jewels because they have no light of their own." He looked directly into her eyes, a gaze so intense it felt like he was reading the very script of her soul. "But a man who has lived in the shadows as long as I have, he learns to look for something else. He learns the law of the treasure hunter. You see, in the high desert, we don't look for the sun. We look for the reflection in the dark. We look for the cracks." Silas reached out, his thumb grazing the bot bam on her wrist with devastating gentleness. "In the East, they have a way of fixing broken pottery. They don't throw it away, and they don't try to hide the damage. They mend the cracks with pure gold. They believe the piece is more beautiful, more valuable, for having been broken. It's called kintsugi. It's a philosophy of the soul." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. All her life, she had viewed her nomad blood and her family's rejection as a series of flaws that made her broken. She had lived as a shadow because she believed she was too damaged to exist in the light. "I chose you," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed against the rocks. "Because you're the only thing in that entire territory that isn't a lie. Every insult they threw at you, every time they tried to make you feel small, it didn't break you. It tempered you. You think those cracks in your heart make you weak? To a man like me, those cracks are where the light gets in. They're the proof that you've survived the fire." He took the raw ore back and tossed it into the darkness. "Real power doesn't come from a name or a bank account, Clara. It comes from being the same person in the dark that you are in the light. Beatrice is a hollow doll. Her beauty is a mask that will rot. But you, You have a fire in you that the desert wind couldn't blow out. You've been a queen in your own heart for 20 years. Even if you were the only one who knew it. Clara looked down at her mother's shawl, then up at the endless canopy of stars. For the first time, she didn't feel like a victim of fate. She felt like a masterpiece in progress. The elite hunt for jewels because they're easy to find, Silas said, stepping back toward the horse. But a treasure hunter, he waits. He watches for the one thing that doesn't belong. He looks for the soul that has walked through hell and come out swinging. I didn't save you tonight, Clara, I just recognized you. He offered his hand again. And this time, Clara didn't hesitate. As she climbed back onto the saddle, she realized that the price of belonging was a debt she no longer owed. She wasn't a girl with nomad blood. She was a woman whose cracks were mended with the gold of her own courage. And in the arms of the man who saw the treasure in the dust. Clara Thorne finally understood that the most beautiful things in the world aren't the ones that are perfect. They're the ones that have been tested and found worth keeping. 6 months had passed, but in the frontier, 6 months can feel like a lifetime. The dusty streets of Oakhaven were a world away from the high mesas where Clara now lived. Here, the air was clean, tasting of freedom and cedar smoke instead of stale perfume and secrets. She woke every morning not to the sound of Beatrice's cold commands, but to the steady rhythm of a heart that chose her. Silas was there, always there, a constant warmth against the desert chill. Clara had become something of a legend among the nomadic camps and the hidden valley settlements. They called her the Star of the Ridge. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was a woman who mediated disputes between ranchers, who organized supplies for the orphanages in the lower territories, and who rode a horse with the grace of someone who had finally claimed her own land. One afternoon, a courier brought a letter. The envelope was smudged with dirt. The burgundy wax seal cracked and dull. Clara recognized the handwriting immediately, precise, sharp, and once full of so much venom. It was from Beatrice. Sister, the letter began, I don't ask for your pity, but I find myself unable to look in the mirror without seeing the monster I was. Oakhaven is falling. Father's debts finally swallowed the house. The silver mines have gone dry. And with them, our status. I was jealous. I was always jealous because you had a peace inside you that no amount of silk could buy me. I told myself you were weak so I wouldn't have to admit that I was the one who was empty. I hope Silas sees in you what I was too blind to recognize. Clara read the words twice, the desert wind fluttering the paper in her hand. A year ago, this letter would have been her victory. She would have wanted to see Beatrice in the dust. But as she looked out over the vast, red horizon, she felt nothing but a quiet, steady calm. We often mistake strength for the ability to strike back, to roar at those who hurt us. But looking at Clara, you see a different kind of power, the power of inner peace. Beatrice had everything, the diamonds, the titles, the attention, yet she lived in a constant, burning thirst for more. Clara had nothing, so she learned to find everything within herself. This is the storm's eye philosophy. The world can strip away your name. They can mock your blood. And they can leave you in an attic to rot. But they cannot touch the way you see yourself unless you hand them the keys. Clara won not because she found a man with a silver eye, but because even when she stood in that opera house in a tattered shawl, she stood like a queen observing a kingdom that no longer had power over her. She folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. Maybe one day she would write back. Maybe healing was possible, even for wounds that went as deep as Oakhaven's mines. But that was a decision for tomorrow. For now, she had a life that was real. She walked toward the ridge where Silas was waiting, his silhouette etched against the setting sun. He reached out, his calloused hand finding hers, his thumb tracing the star on her wrist. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice a low rumble of sage and home. Clara smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and warmed her from within. "Everything is perfect, Silas." She realized then that you don't need a crown to be royalty. You just need to build a kingdom inside yourself, where kindness is the only law and peace is the only throne. When you do that, destiny doesn't just find you, it bows to you. The desert was vast, the future was unwritten, and Clara Thorne was finally Truly, free. If you've ever felt like a ghost in your own life, remember, the desert only looks empty to those who don't know where to find the treasure. Stay strong, stay real, and never let anyone tell you that your cracks are anything less than gold. Clara's story isn't just a tale from a dusty frontier town. It's a mirror for anyone who has ever felt like a ghost in their own life. We wait for a Silas Vane to ride in and pull us out of the shadows. But the truth is far deeper than that. The most powerful moment in Oakhaven wasn't when Silas took Clara's hand. It was when Clara chose to let go of her father's name. Don't wait for someone else to recognize your worth. Don't wait for a hero to tell you that you're not broken. The world might try to tell you that your cracks are failures, that your history makes you unworthy of the light. But they are wrong. Your resilience is your crown. Your silence in the face of cruelty is your throne. You are the only person who can decide if you are a ghost or a queen. Build that kingdom inside yourself, where no one else's judgment can reach. Because once you find that peace in the center of the storm, the world doesn't just stop ignoring you, it starts to follow your lead. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever felt like you were just a down payment for someone else's debts, I want you to know that you are seen. Share this story with someone who needs to remember their own light. Tag a friend who is fighting a battle in the shadows. Thank you for being part of this journey with Clara and Silas. If you enjoyed this remix of Fate and Dust, hit that like button and subscribe to join our camp out here on the frontier. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment below and let me know. Does Clara's story feel like yours? I read every single one of your thoughts. Until next time, keep your head high and your heart wild. You are the star of your own ridge.